We're going to talk this afternoon about applied remote viewing. There are, in my view, three faces to remote viewing. Well, spontaneous field research, basic laboratory research, and applied research. Spontaneous field research is universally reported across time and culture, geography. Everybody's in every culture has got these stories. It's extremely difficult to study because it can't be predicted. And the reports are almost always uncontrolled anecdotes. Basic laboratory research, in contrast, has a baseline against which variance from chance is the critical measurement. It has a statistical outcome, usually. In most instances, it sees the statistical analysis of the data as the end product of the experiment. And it is principally done by one discipline. That is, many different people may get involved, but they have a parapsychological orientation. This is typical remote viewing that we would see in the laboratory. You've seen a lot of it over the course of this conference. These are experiments that were done in a national test that I ran in Omni some years ago, and these are completely untrained, first-time remote viewers. And this is a particularly nice one. I picked a couple that I like. There are lots of them. It says waterfalls, large trees, rushing sound of roaring water, and then the little drawing over there. It would be hard-pressed to make a clearer description of Niagara. These are the falls in Brazil, actually. Here's another one that I like. The target was the Eiffel Tower, and the person says a big iron triangle in which people go up, and you can see the people lined up to go up, and of course, it's exactly what the Eiffel Tower looks like. These were all easy first-place matches. Applied research, in contrast, may use statistics, but it's only as a part of the analytical process. The parapsychological aspect is principally a mechanism, this is an important point, for generating hypotheses which will be tested by field work. Frequently, there is no baseline against which to measure variance because we don't know where it is, we don't know how many of them there are. Although I have done a number of experiments where it has been possible using the kind of grid analysis that Dean was talking about this morning to arrive at a statistical analysis. It's almost always interdisciplinary, and many of the people that are involved may not know anything at all about parapsychology and may have no interest in parapsychology, in fact, and may, in fact, be highly skeptical of it. The way I have gone at this is a methodology that has evolved over the course of about 20 years. It's the Mobius methodology, named after a laboratory that I headed for 2 decades. And its premise is that the use of psi in an application setting is an engineering problem involving a biocircuit. And by that I mean everybody who is involved with the experiment is like a chip in the circuit. I have come to believe, although I can't provide a lot of data for this is my opinion, that one of the critical keys to a successful experiment is shared intention. That is, that everybody joins together, connected by some network, as if we were, in a sense, all workstations on the cosmic internet, that we are all linked up. Russell touched a little bit about this, and this is why I think the comments that both Dean and Russ made earlier on about the importance of the spirit and the sense of meditation and focus, I think this is a coherence problem, and that if you look at people who are successful at this, they seem to get at their focus in one of two ways. Either they have neurotic focus, that is, they become obsessed and develop obsessive behaviors, or they develop some kind of discipline that allows them to suppress noise and pick up this anomalous signal. Psi in applied work is not the end product. It's only a sensing technology useful in directing field work. As with any remote sensing technology, its principal challenges are obtaining the strongest input, obtaining the best signal-to-noise ratio, and interpreting the signal. In a sense, what I am describing for you is the same kind of thing that's done by an anti-submarine warfare officer who is aboard a ship that's on top of the sea, and he's searching for a target that is under the sea. He never actually sees it. He only sees it indirectly through the mediation of his sensor arrays. He has to interpret them. He has to accommodate for their limitations. Exactly in that way is how I put these circuits together. My approach has been the 5-team biocircuit. There's no such thing as an omniscientist. You simply can't command all of the information. And it's very important to know what you don't know. And I am always very mindful of all the things I don't know. There are many disciplines required to make one of these applied experiments work. And they are only asked to work in their area of competence. Now, I've heard a lot of stuff about people saying, well, there's not any acceptance, it's very hard to get this worked out. My experience has been a well-designed experiment, and I think Russ and probably Dean would support this, is that a well-designed experiment, if you go to it and you go to a first-class scientist, not some middle-level person, but one of the really serious folk in their field, that if they can see that it is a well-designed experiment and it has an interesting task to do, no one ever says no. At least no one's ever said no to me. There are the remote viewers, that's one team, the parapsychology team, the archaeology team. These are archaeology experiments I'm speaking about here, but it could be criminology or something else. The specialist team, these are specialist consultants who are brought in to help understand the data, and the record keepers, who are very important in the process. There were, in this experiment in Alexandria, Egypt, there were 11 viewers who participated in the map phase, as I will describe it in a minute, and there were 2 who actually went with us to Egypt. George McMullen on the left is a Canadian. He would describe himself as a typical working class man. He worked as a parts manager in an auto dealership, was a fisherman. Hella Hamid was a fine arts photographer who got into remote viewing because Russell originally used her as a control. There is clearly something about people who are really good at this. Dean talked about that a little bit this morning. Both of these people, both George and Hella, had a deep spiritual view of the world, although not a religious one. Both of them had very clear intention. They had a creative bent. George is a novelist. He's written about 5 novels now. Hella was a fine arts photographer of international reputation. Those people who remember the Life magazine, the Record of Man, she has some photographs in that. Work's well known all over. The parapsychology team, this is Beverly Humphreys, who was working at SRI at the time, and in addition to myself. And our job is to see that the parapsychological aspects of the project are done in accordance with a rigorously designed protocol. These are not fishing expeditions. We go out for very specific things. In this instance, we were looking for the tomb of Alexander the Great, the lighthouse of Pharos, the palace of Cleopatra, a buried building in the buried city of Maria, and the library. And as it developed, some other things additionally, particularly a cistern, as I'll describe. Well, I don't know what that is, but anyway, that should be 2 other archaeologists, Mikolowski Radzejevic, the head of the archaeological mission in Alexandria, Egypt, and Daoud Abu Daoud. Good heavens, what is that? No, it's indexing. Daoud Abu Daoud, who was the secretary of the Society for Archaeology in Alexandria, Egypt. This is Fakhrani. These were all professors at the University of Alexandria and collectively had over a century of experience in Alexandrine archaeology, which is a very specialized area. It's not just any archaeologist. Archaeologists, as you probably know, spend their whole lives concentrated on one or two very specific digs or excavations. Rajevich, whose picture isn't there, ran the Komel Dika dig, which is the largest dig that's ever been done in Alexandria. So these people bring a lot of really specialized knowledge. However, none of that would have helped any of the remote viewers, because all of the questions, and the reason I got interested in archaeology was that it was a field in which there was a defined problem. The question that archaeology always faces is where to look. If you look through the literature, you find that many of the finds, maybe even most of the finds that have been made are serendipitous. Natives digging a pathway through the jungle, uncover something. In Alexandria, there was a find that was made. A man was walking his donkey home and it fell through a hole. So a lot of it is serendipity, and it therefore was very attractive for me for remote viewing, because these were questions for which there was a clearly defined body of knowledge of what was known and an equally clearly defined body of knowledge of what wasn't known. And therefore, if someone could tell you where to go to look for something and describe what you would see when you got there, everybody could agree without any controversy that this was not something that you went to the library and read up on a book. This is the specialist team. This is Harold Edgerton, probably one of America's premier scientists at the time. He invented strobe photography, the side-scan sonar. He was the head of the radio strobe lab at MIT. He was the chairman of the board of EG&G, one of the country's largest electronics firms. Wonderful man. This is Kay Croissant and Kathy Dees. These were two historians who did the historical research for us. Spent about 2 years in preparation for this once we got started to help act as an interface with the archaeologists so that we could interpret what the remote viewers were telling us. Because as you have heard, as we've gone through the conference and knowledge you know from before, that it's oftentimes very difficult to figure out what it is they're trying to tell you, because it either requires specialized language to describe it. George once described an early man skull by talking about the molars, and what he meant was the molars of the teeth. So it took a lot of prep work. These projects take a long time to put together. This one took about 2 years to do the prep for and really get ready, get the permissions, get the government involved. It takes a lot of permissions. It's a complicated process. So we then begin with the data gathering phase, the pre-field work phase. This was done I was in Los Angeles with the historians, and the remote viewers were scattered all over North America and Italy, England. We start with either mailing out envelopes, each of which contains a question. You're going to actually see them in a minute. In which there's one question per envelope. The envelopes are numbered. The people who are going to do the remote viewing come in. They have no idea what they're going to be asked, no prep work at all. They just start, do you want to participate in an experiment? It's an actual experiment. So they are tabula rasa. No one has given them any information at all. I want to point out, you'll notice the maps. You'll see this a little more later on. We take all the colors off the maps and the place names off the maps so that there's no queuing. This is Hella. We tape record or videotape all of the sessions. We ask them to not only first locate things, then when they have located something, we ask them to go there. I say to them, you are life size, because of an experiment that had been done at SRI involving Hella, where she had described Raggedy Ann's leg, and it took them a long time to figure out that it was the size. So we say to people, you are life size, and you go, please go to this place, and if you could describe it, what would you say? And they make drawings after they do the descriptions. We get all of the maps. Now, each person gets an individual map. You can see that the map, all the colors are out. This is actually done with a blueprint process. We make a Mylar master and then make copies for each person. And we take all of the maps that have registry marks in them. We put them on a light table, and we look with the light shining up, and we look for where the circles overlap. And those are the consensus zones. And here's a consensus zone that have the yellow around them, where there are multiple people that seem to have made the same locations. Then we do another level of analysis that involves the language that was used. I was very interested to hear Dean say, it was the first time I'd heard somebody say that words are particularly good. My own view is that the use of language, the way remote viewers use it, is very important. So each mark represents them. Here's a close-up of the consensus zones. This is the map of Alexandria, Egypt. This was a British Army chart that we were able to obtain. Now I think I would use I would use satellite photographs with global positioning marks, but that wasn't available then. We try to build an unimpeachable chronology so that copies of all the maps, the transcripts, and the drawings are individually notarized. You'll see some examples of that in a minute. The copies of all the notarized material are turned over to an otherwise uninvolved individual who secures them in a safety deposit box only he controls. This work was all controlled by a man named Richard Gunther out in Los Angeles, who he put it in a safety deposit box, and he held the key, and we kept it there for about 15 or 20 years. The bank records, the bank records each access to the data, so it's possible to establish absolutely what was predicted and what was found. You can't slip in any extra material. This is all done to deal with skeptics. The archaeologists don't really care, but it's part of the parapsychological aspect of it. All the archaeologists care about is, tell me where to dig, and what do you think I'm going to find when I get there? Now, these are the transcriptions. We take the transcriptions, and these are actual transcriptions. R1, each remote viewer respondent gets a number. So this is the very first viewer. This is the fourth viewer, the ninth viewer. And we transcribe what they say, and this is how a case gets built up for a location. So they say, well, there's some kind of statue, and it's golden brown, it's smooth texture, you can read this. Sense of a lot of marble, a lot of metal mixed with the marble. Now, these are individual people. Now, they, of course, have no idea what the other people are saying. Each person is interviewed separately, or if they do it by mail because they live in other countries, they open these envelopes one at a time, they answer the questions, do the drawings, put everything back in the envelopes, put all of that back into the thing along with an audio tape that they make. So here's some more of this. Then we begin breaking down the concepts so that you see this is the R1, this is the first little chunk of information. This is the second chunk, see R1, 2, R3, R4, and then you can see how it goes as it goes along. And then those concepts, we begin to assemble them, not imposing any pattern on them, but allowing the pattern to emerge from the data. That is, we didn't ask questions about statues. What I said was, in a very large city, and Alexandria is a city of millions, and the stuff we're looking for is under the ground, how will I know where to look for it? So give me descriptions of surface geographical information that will tell me that I'm in the right location. And so what emerged out of this was that all of these people began talking about this statue as a place that was near the tomb. So one of them says, R11 says there's some kind of statue, R457 says there's an angel, a lot of marble, metal mixed with marble. Description of the statue, golden browns, smooth, golden, big wings, bangs. I particularly like that. We look for things that have a low a priori probability. That is, if I ask you to locate a ship and you talk to me about anchors, well, I mean, ships have anchors. And so you may be correct, but it's very hard to know because, I mean, ships have anchors. All ships have anchors. But bangs was an odd kind of comment. A lot of marble, metal mixed with marble, also interesting comment. The location to this underground site, well, it's nearby, it's near there, it's near the site. Then you can take this and back and look at the map and begin to work out what it is they're trying to say. And site characteristics, well, it's noisy. I smell something, fumes, the sounds of cars. It's clearly, that tells us when we're looking for it. This is clearly something out of doors. We don't cue them. We don't say, is it out of doors? We just say, describe this, and this is what they volunteer. So now you put all that together and you develop a set of hypotheses which you will then refine by the on-site field work. Additional remote viewing. In this case, as I said, we took Hella and George. And this is now, these are how we worked it out. This is, there was a description of a cistern. We took Hella down. She made this drawing. Now, you see this is really badly done, but this is the notary's seal stamped right across the drawing. I said, now I want to be sure that these drawings can't be falsified. So what the woman decided to do was she didn't do it on all of them, but she just stamped it right on top of the drawing. So there's the thing. And you can see, here are these arches. She says there's flowing water down here. It's going through this kind of conduit. And she said it's down about 18 feet. And so we looked for the location that she had given us. And this is an archaeologist from whose name I can't remember right now, from the Department of Public Works in Alexandria. He graduated from Alexandria University, and this is Mikolowski-Rajevich. And there is the remote viewing. This is a Byzantine cistern that is about 18 to 20 feet below the surface. And you can see the correlation between the arches. You can't see, but underneath here there is water that is still, this is the remnants of the ancient water system, and there is still water trickling through. Now the tomb. When Alexander died, a fight broke out amongst his generals. And one of them, the oldest of them, a man named Ptolemy Soter, he said to the others, look, guys, I know we're going to have this big fight about the empire, and I'm too old. Leave me alone. Just give me Egypt, and that's all I want. And all these other people who thought that the key to the succession after Alexander would be to control Roxanne and the child Arahidrus, they all said, okay, old man, you go down to Egypt and we'll leave you alone. What none of them thought, their testosterone running at full bore, was that Egypt was the only place in the empire that had completely defensible natural borders, had an existing civil service of 1,000-year-old duration, and a docile civil population. So he went down, and then he apparently, we don't know exactly how, he bribed the leader of the funeral cortege as it made its way back, and he got hold of the body. A small aside, this is exactly what Stalin did, and Stalin, who was a seminarian student in a Russian Orthodox seminary, never forgot that lesson, and that's why Lenin's tomb is in the Red Square. Anyway, Soter got the body and he had it prepared for display, and he built what's called the Soma, which was this tomb. And so we asked people to locate the tomb. We didn't say anything about what it looked like. We just said locate it and then describe what you think was there. And so this is one person's example of it. This is a second person's example of it. Notice the underground thing. They all of them said it's underground. there was this cupola sort of thing on the top, but it's underground. This one I particularly like because you'll notice the little pyramid. Now, when I first saw it, I thought, oh, well, this is just analytical overlay. It's Egypt, pyramids, you know. But it turns out, the historians told me, that a later Ptolemy established a dynasty which went down to Cleopatra. She's actually Cleopatra the Seventh. She was the last of the Soters. Basically, this family owned Egypt. This was their property until Cleopatra. And one of the later Soters, they were a mixed lot, some better than others. He took off the dome, some authorities say, and he built this kind of pyramidical structure. So that struck me as a particularly interesting observation because even if you assume, well, you know, funerary architecture has columns and domes, well, maybe that, but the little pyramid was quite nice, as are the little ram's heads that you see around here. Now, we do not know from the sources from antiquity whether the ram's heads were actually there, at least I don't know. But the ram was associated with Alexander because he went down to Siwa to see the psychic, the clairvoyant oracle that was at Siwa, the oracle of Amun-Ra, who said he was the son of Ra. And so ever after that, whose symbol was the ram, so ever after that, when you see pictures of Alexander, you'll often see the horns of the ram. So here we're looking for this statue. We're going to look for the soma. Well, what do we look for? We know that we're on the right track because the cistern has turned up, but we're looking for a golden brown, smooth textured, golden big wings, bangs, lots of marble, but metal mixed with the marble. It's outside. There's a lot of cars got to be around it because people can smell the automobiles and the noise. One of them even drew a picture. See the high wings. Now notice the proportion of the wings. That's very interesting. Notice the gold color. See, she's put a little gold there. This is near Alexander's tomb. So that's the drawing of the statue. There's the statue. This is the only monument of its kind in Alexandria, and it's one of those great civic things that they put up. And a couple of things I would point out to you. There was an error. This is not an angel. That was interpretation sneaking in. These are palm fronds, not wings, but they are proportioned like this. There are the bangs. I love the bangs. There's the cloth draped over the breast, you see, and the expression, that staring ahead expression. Then we're now in Alexandria, and we say to Hella, okay, we've located the statue. Now nearby you've placed us, so we need for you to give us some guidance. And she says, well, I think it's next to this area where there's fallen support beams, huge wood, over an underground sewer which has daylight at the end. And then this thing converges sort of at a peak here, and there's all these wood things. And she said it's like a street or an alley with high walls on either side. There it is. We put her in a car and we said, now somewhere is this thing that you've described, take us to it. And she did. There are the fallen beams, there's the sewer with the daylight in the end, there's the pillar that you saw on the side, the high walls. Well, I don't know how to back up. Anyway, if somebody can tell me how to back up, I will, but... Oh, I don't want to touch the arrow key. I repose no confidence in the arrow key. Chris, what do I hit? Oh, okay. Dean? Hit the back arrow.
It's not that control alternate delete thing, is it?
We're going to stick with what we know. Okay. This is the Mosque of Nebi Daniel. And it's right across the street, sort of up this way from that alleyway that you saw. Right across the street. And this is Hella, and she's saying, oh dear. Well, what she's saying is the tomb is right underneath here. It's really just reduced to debris and rubble, and there's no body in it. And so we went into this mosque, and we found there was a crypt underneath. And George said, "This is the location of the tomb." And I see that behind this wall here, right there, that there's debris and walls, but the tomb is empty. And so we brought Hella back. We do them one at a time, back and forth. We brought Hella down, and she says there's a wall, and then there's debris, and then there's another wall. So there it is. Debris, a wall, debris, and another wall. That's the archaeologist Fakirani who ran the dig. I don't do the digs. Once we give them the information, turn it over to the archaeologists, they run the archaeology. This is a man from the Division of Mosques, which is a separate agency in the government in Egypt. And he said further success and we'd have to tear the mosque down and there would be riots. This was at a very delicate time in Egyptian politics. It's quite impossible. But its story's not quite over. Because if the tomb was empty, and by the way, this is a time capsule. I believe that at some point in the future, somebody will get permission to dig underneath and next to Nebi Daniel Mosque, and that we will find remnants of the tomb. But we thought, well, okay, if the tomb is empty, are there any remnants? I mean, is anything left of Alexander, or did it just get lost? And so we asked George and Hella, and George particularly said, oh, yeah. The cloth and the leather and the dampness over time underneath his breastplate and his leggings had turned his body and the bones a sort of reddish blue. An odd kind of observation. So I paid close attention to those. The bones were ransomed from a caliph in the middle of the 7th century and taken by people who looked like Arabs, but somehow they were not. Now, I didn't know a lot about Alexandrian archaeology or Alexandrian history, so I went back to the historians. I tried to keep myself actually fairly blank until afterwards. And it turns out that in 641 AD, the Viceroy Cyril surrendered to the Caliph Omar in one of the strangest surrenders ever. He agreed to remove Rome from Alexandria, despite the fact that Alexandria was impregnable, that the Caliph had no navy, that they couldn't be attacked from land. For whatever reason, Cyril agreed to give up Alexandria, and he struck a deal with the marshal of the Caliph's army that they would have a year in which to leave. And they paid a huge ransom for this year, like 3 million, I've forgotten, of gold, something of gold. And during that year, everybody who could got out. So this odd little comment of George, who has an 8th grade education and had no idea he was going to be asked these questions, so would have been very unlikely, and it was in Egypt where he couldn't have found the books even if he wanted to. It's an odd little observation. They took them into the desert. That's where they are. Some months later, after we had finished, we did this project in several phases. Most of the people had gone home, and the film crew, who film everything, so the whole project is filmed and photographed, so all of this stuff is on film. We got a call from the Alan Landsberg operation, who had just read that the bones of John the Baptist had reportedly been discovered at a monastery named Wadi Natrun, the monastery of San Macario. So this is the monastery, which is the oldest Coptic monastery in Egypt. It's about 2/3 of the way up the road the desert road between Alex and Cairo, off to the right as you're going up toward Cairo. And it's this enormous walled village. You can see the walls, and it has only one door. And these people have been here since the 7th century and have unbroken continuity and have an extraordinary library that really has never been properly examined. So we went up to film the, the discovery of these bones. We talked to, this was the crypt where they were found. They were in a chapel that it had been forgotten completely by the monks, but the monks had gotten some money to rebuild a chapel that was falling down that was called the Chapel of John the Baptist. And it had always been an odd chapel because when they did a certain part of the Mass, they turned and faced this blank wall and bowed, and nobody knew why, but that's just the way you did it. But when they pulled down part of the floor to build up the walls that were having problems, they discovered this crypt, and in the crypt they discovered all these bones, which are now residing in this rather handsome wooden box that's in the chapel. This is in the chapel. And here they are. These boxes are, this is a bag of bones. So I went up to the monastery and I talked to Father John, who was the priest of the monastery that was the person who dealt with outsiders. And I said, geez, thinking no connection to Alexandria at all. This business with George had happened months earlier. Is there anything you can tell me about the bones? And he said, well, some of the bones, not many, have a reddish stain. We don't know the cause. Nothing in the crypt explains it. And I said, well, where did the bones come from? And he said, well, where did they come from? Well, our tradition tells us they were brought here by mule they're out in the desert, during the 7th century, at the time when the Islamic army was destroying shrines and relics. And I said, well, where did they come from? And he said, why, from Alexandria, from the church that was on the spot where the Nebi Daniel Mosque now sits. And so I believe the monks will not allow any examination. They view them as relics. They don't know which ones are John the Baptist. There are bones of a number of people in this bag. And because they don't know which ones are John the Baptist, they won't let anybody examine any of them. But I think in time it may be possible, and with DNA research now. But I think this is very probable that this is where the bones of Alexander the Great reside. And I don't assert that, but that's my personal conviction. And I think that further research by others will probably ascertain this in time. So, like the remnant of the tomb, this is one of those little time capsules. And these become very important, as you're going to see with the Eastern Harbor research, because sometimes it takes a long time to figure out what's right and what's wrong. So now I want to take you to the buried city of Maria. Maria was a pleasure city. It was kind of the Las Vegas, I guess, of Alexandria. It was about 30 kilometers outside of the city. There's nothing there now, as you'll see. It had a lake called Lake Mariotis, which is now heavily polluted and very shallow. When they built the Aswan Dam, it changed the whole water table of the country and changed the flow of the rivers and of the Nile. And so Maria is forgotten. It's just a little footnote in history now, and therefore a wonderful place to do remote viewing. And so this came up as a result of the archaeologists in Alexandria. They were so taken aback by the discoveries at Nebi Daniel and the cistern that they said, well, we'd really like to see a demonstration all the way through. And I said, okay, well, where can we do this? Well, Maria was the place that they picked, and I like these things, particularly where I can compare the remote viewing data with electronic remote sensing. In my book out there, Mind Rover, you will see that almost every paper compares electronic remote sensing with remote viewing. I think they're very useful to see what each can do. So we started, of course, with the map, only the map wasn't very helpful because this is the only map that existed, and that little dot is Maria. So it would be pretty hard to mark where anything was, but we gave it to Hella and George the night before and said, just sort of tune into it, focus on it, and be prepared to answer questions tomorrow. Now, happily, as I said, there was an independent remote sensing survey that had been previously done. This was done by the University of Guelph by a man named Sadek, and he had done a ground-penetrating magnetometer survey, and that had gone from here to here. Now that right there, as you're going to see, is the little site that we were in, but he didn't have anything at that site, so that was lovely. That made a real good test because electronic remote sensing had surveilled the site and had found nothing, and so if we located something in an area that, I mean, they had found things, but if we located something at a site that was not one that they had picked, then we had an even cleaner test. So we drove out into the desert. This is Maria. This is actually about 20 kilometers away from Maria. We took George out, and Hella was not present. Bev Humphreys stayed back with Hella. I took George out into the middle of the desert. This is very much like, Palm Springs, sort of, in appearance. Alexandria is about the same latitude as Los Angeles. And Fakirani gave him an instruction. He said, locate the ancient city of Maria. It's somewhere within a rough area, roughly 24 kilometers on a side, it's about half the size of Los Angeles, basically. And after you locate the city, I want you to locate a building that either has tile, fresco, or mosaic decoration. Within the chosen building, I want you to locate the walls, the windows, the doors, and the depth at which the floor would be found. And describe any artifacts or conditions which would be found within the building site. And so George and I set out, marching across the desert. That's a remnant of a Bedouin village that's there. Now the question that I would ask you is, where would you look? Right? I also want to tell you that it's about 115 degrees. And sand flies are very bad. You know, people say all the time, remote viewing, you have to have ideal conditions and all that. I've put people in submarines. I put them in boats in the sea, take them out in the desert. You know, I figure if you're still breathing, you can remote view. And we walk around for a couple hours. And then George says, well, I know where I want to go. And he kneels down in the sand, and you can't quite see it very well in this picture, and he draws a little drawing of the area. And he says, I know where this building is, and it has several rooms, and it's part of a larger complex. And he located the walls and the doors, the corners of the structure, indicated the culture was Byzantine, and described the probable depth to the tops of the walls at about 3 feet. And indicated there'd be debris that had been dropped after being taken from another structure, said one wall, the west one, would have tiles on it, explained the culture or cultures which had built it, and so forth, that had been used for storage. He felt we should come across the floor of the structure at about 6 to 10 feet, although he confessed, I can't see the floor. I'll come back to that in a minute. Said that green was the most strongly perceived color. Oh, great. Well, that's supposed to be a picture. We then took George away, and we brought in Hella, who was by this time had signs of sunstroke and was nauseated. And so we didn't ask her to do all the walking. I just took her up into the general area where George was and said, look down under, I didn't tell her what he said, just look down under the ground, see what you see. So she said, I see walls, several colors, but green, tiles, green, northwest corner she outlined. She says, I have a sense that there's a bathroom or something to do with bathing and washing. Baths and washing. The floor of mosaic tile, smooth tile, being laid in a design, an important building, had more than one room. And her strongest perception was of an alcove sort of room containing what looked like a broken column or a statue or something that was round and freestanding but not complete. So then we take Hella home, back to the hotel. We bring George back out again, and we say, okay, let's not shilly-shally around here, George. We want you to put stakes in the ground where the building line is oriented and mark all the corners and mark the door. So we give him these stakes. As you can see, here I'm putting another one. This is the length of a wall. And you can see here. And so just as the excavation was beginning, he said, well, there'd be small tiles would be found at the level of the floor. The tiles would be marble, smooth on one side, rough on the other. They were part of a floor that had been laid in a chalky subflooring. But it really bothered him because he said, I can't see the floor. I know what it was, but I don't think it's there. He said the tiles were square. They were 5/8 of an inch across, one color each. They had been laid in a colored pattern. Oh, dear, oh, dear. And then he drew them. So I don't know, this has gotten screwed up. And then he made a little drawing of exactly what the tiles would look like. We came back the following day. We could only dig from about 6:30 in the morning when the sun came up to about 10 or 11 o'clock, because by 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, it was about 120 degrees, and even the Bedouin workers couldn't work. So he described also at that point these ledges that would be found, and he also thought there was something associated with Roman baths or bathing, and it really bothered him because he was convinced it was a Byzantine building. Now, Fakirani, who was actually running the dig, he thought this was all nonsense. He said that there would never be a building oriented in that way. It wouldn't be a Byzantine building, it would be a Roman building if there were a building there, but there's not a building there because the University of Guelph has already surveyed this area, so the whole thing is nonsense. He was highly skeptical. So there we go. Now, you can just see the little stake that George put in right over there. And here, the beginning of the merging of the walls. George was about 6 inches off in the depth. And you can see that it's a complex of several rooms. Here's this little alcove room. And there emerged this strange, I just love this. Hella is really good at this. When we did a submarine experiment off Catalina Island, she described an anomalous block that we would find. And this is right up there. This thing, nobody had any idea what this was. None of the archaeologists, but there it was. It was this kind of low-grade pottery column. You'll see it a little better. We began finding Byzantine, this is a Byzantine pottery sherd. There were hundreds of them. We found some green tiles. Although the green was although they felt the most strongly about it, it was the least accurate observation. This piece of marble, which is obviously of a higher quality than other things that were found, Radjevich identified as part of marble that would be used in baths. And you remember that they said that debris would have been brought from other sites. About a year later, they discovered what had been the Roman baths. And they found that this marble, by identifying the marble, debris had been thrown into the site that we had got, which explained why George saw Roman baths, even though he was sure the site was Byzantine, which is the Christian period after 303. This was a Christian building. Here's the consecration mark on the ledge. See the ledge, by the way? I meant to say that. And there are the tiles. They were found on top of the remnants of a chalky subfloor. In one corner, there were about 8 of them we found eventually. They're smooth on one side, rough on the other, sitting in this chalky bed. They're round instead of square, and they're 1 1/4 inches across. So it's about a 5/8 inch mistake out of half the size of Los Angeles. That's pretty good accuracy. Oh, there's the drawing. Well, it came up. Here's the little drawing that George made. See the little tile, and then the subfloor, and then the dirt? And here's the pattern that he saw. This was just something he sketched on some yellow foolscap. There's one of those notary symbols. All of this stuff, every day we took all of the material that was produced that day by remote viewing. We took it over, we had it notarized, and shipped it back to the United States. So it was out of copies, so that it was out of our control. And there's the finished dig. Now, here are the ledges. Here is the column. This turned out to be, we finally found out, this was a kind of Libyan nomadic oven that must have been built long, long after the building was had been abandoned, when it was probably just walls up to about like that. You can see where it goes. And one of the workers, finally, one of the Libyan workers, overheard us talking about this, and he could overhear the Arabic part. And he said, oh, well, that's what, he explained that what the women do is they build a fire around this thing, and it gets hot, and then they slap the bread on it. And the heat cooks the bread. So they build these fires out of camel dung and whatever, anything else they can find that burns. And it eventually heats up this pottery and keeps it hot enough so that because it has so much thermal mass, so that because there's very little burnable material, so that you get the maximum amount of impact from everything you can burn. Now we'll go to the Eastern Harbor. Now the Eastern Harbor is really quite wonderful because many of you probably remember that the French are now reporting the discovery of all these things in the Eastern Harbor of Alexandria. And they're doing wonderful work, which I completely support. The problem is, if there is a problem, just an observation, is that it was all found 16 years earlier. And we'll go through that. Now here's the Eastern Harbor. This was a harbor that was built by Alexander, and it was at one time one of the most important harbors in the world. The city has, of course, completely, everything is lost. This corniche that was built late 19th, early 20th century now runs along the sea, and this is Fort Cecilia, which is a low rise, like a little peninsula that goes out. Harold Edgerton came over, and I asked him, again, to look at the remote sensing versus remote viewing. So I asked him if he would do a sub-bottom profile using side-scan sonar. And so he did this. He brought his instrument. See his little EGG thing there? And he produced this, and he was unsuccessful at locating anything because of the particulate matter in the water. This is not true anymore, but at this time, they were dumping raw sewage into the harbor for part of the day, and it was just fairly awful. And there was a lot of particulate matter you'll see in the photographs. So the one thing that he was able to confirm from the side-scan sonar was that the remote viewing, which had described the seawall as about 65 feet further out than anybody thought, that was in fact true. Now, from the point of view of the archaeologists who were involved, particularly Rejayevich, that was the most important thing we ever found, because it meant that the city's orientation was quite different than had previously been thought. No one had actually known how far out the ancient city extended. And when we found these Ptolemaic walls, the remnants of them, then they were able to establish the orientation differently. So side-scan sonar wasn't very useful. Now, the kind the French are using now is more sophisticated, and the water is clearer because of the change in the way the sewage system operates, and so they had much better success. What you're going to see was discovered in a matter of hours. Hours. That's the thing about remote viewing. When it works and it locks on, what it does is offer efficiency, and it doesn't really change. There's no downside, because the worst case scenario that remote viewing can produce is the best case scenario that you would get using traditional techniques. I mean, if it does nothing other than prioritize, if you've got 10 sites and you say, well, try this one first, that's where it is, then, and it's correct, then you don't have to look for the other 9 sites. So it has an efficiency aspect to it that I think is particularly important, and they're telling me to wrap it up. Well, I'm getting pretty close. Okay, so I'll go as fast as I can. All right. So here are the remote viewings. Here's where everything was located, you see. We did another map probe on this. The original map probe had produced underwater sites, and then we went back and focused on them again, and so you can see these. This is the map, the field chart map from the paper. I'm just going to do a couple of them. This, by the way, there are lots of other experiments that are involved in this project, but I've just picked a few of them. This is where the lighthouse of Pharos was thought to be. There had been an earlier expedition run by a woman named Honor Frost, who had reported the discovery of things. I'm not claiming that we discovered the lighthouse of Pharos. I want to be clear about that. We discovered new materials previously unseen by the lighthouse and photographed them for, I think, the first time. But I don't want to, this site, there had been at least a little preliminary work done in the early 60s by Honor Frost, so I want to be sure and give her credit. This is an actual page. This happens to be from George, and this is, I told you, the fortune cookie thing. We put the sheets that have the questions in the envelopes. This is his answer. So there you can see his question, and here is his. This comes out of the second probe because he kept referring to this in the first one. Now, I particularly draw your attention to these round things and the pillars and the big square blocks. There are the big square blocks, and they're huge. You can see, there I am, and I'm 6'3", and you can see how big they are. That was probably, actually, those are slots, and there was probably a huge statue that sat on this thing, and it's now lying on its side, and it was like that, and then something was put in, and these were like the sockets where the statue went. You can see the particulate matter, you can see the problem. That's why there aren't many photographs, but I'll show you this is a statue of Isis that recently they brought it up. Here is a drawing out of the field report, so you get a little clearer sense of what it looked like. The head is missing. Here is a sphinx lying on its side. The head is missing. They brought this up recently as well. Here are the pillars. These are all Aswan granite, which is a reddish kind of granite. Marble is destroyed over time in the sea. Here are the round things that George saw. The photograph, there is a photograph in my book, The Alexandria Project, but it's easier to see them here. And they're about 18 inches across, and they have a socket, and they were some sort of decorative thing. But it was one of those lovely low a priori observations. Now, Cleopatra's Palace. Here are 2 different people, and they have quite similar drawings. Here is the remnant. Here's a capital for a pillar that we found. Now, this was all done in days. Normally, a side-scan sonar survey would take weeks. I think the French actually took months. This was all done in a matter of hours. They described an ancient wreck. Here are the drawings of the ancient wreck. And we found these amphora at the wreck. So this is the French map underneath, which comes out of Archaeology magazine, who, when we published this work originally, they had a skeptic write it off as crank visions cadged from old guidebooks, despite the fact that everybody acknowledged that they didn't know, and the archaeologists in Alexandria had a very different view. But nonetheless, now we come forward. This data has been like a little time capsule. So here's the underneath. This is the Franco-Egyptian group, and you can see laid on, and you can see the locations almost exactly overlap. All of this material is in Mindrover, which is out there, and my book, Alexandria Project, if you're interested in pursuing it at all. You can get it off of my website. I want to close by saying that I think that what is important about this kind of work is not the archaeology or the remote viewing. What this is really telling us, I believe, which is a point that Russell made, is that we need to rethink what it means to be a human being. And indeed, probably we need to rethink all living organisms. Clearly, to my way of thinking anyway, we are, oh, well, thank you. We are all interlinked. Life is a network of interactions. What we call psi, I believe, is just the surfacing into consciousness of one of the channels of information that we are processing all the time. And that if we look at this research, in addition to whatever inferences we may draw about it in terms of archaeology, or in terms of remote viewing, or in terms of physics, or any other area of science, we ought also, ethically, to understand that we are linked in this network. The whole Earth is a part of this, and that the implications of this research tell us that we have responsibilities to maintain an ethical approach to this living network that will leave it in better shape than we received it. Thank you.
Thank you.